I was supposed to marry him in 3 weeks, and I remember sitting on our kitchen floor surrounded by unopened wedding invitations, trying to decide which ones we could still send if we rushed everything, because he had just told me, again, that we needed to postpone, and even then something in my chest felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like my body already knew the truth long before I was ready to face it. We had been together for almost 3 years, and for most of that time, I genuinely believed I had found someone stable, someone who wanted the same kind of life I did, someone who talked about a future not just in vague ideas but in actual details, like where we would live, how many kids we might have, and even what kind of dog we would adopt once things settled down. The proposal had been perfect, or at least I thought it was at the time, because it wasn't extravagant but it felt sincere, and I said yes without hesitation, without doubt, without even considering that there might be parts of his life I knew absolutely nothing about. The first time he asked me for money, it didn't feel like a red flag because he framed it in a way that made it sound temporary and almost embarrassing for him, like he hated asking but had no other choice, and he told me it was just a short-term issue with his business, something about delayed payments and a client who hadn't transferred funds yet, and I remember telling him that it was okay, that we were a team, that this is what partners do. After that, it didn't stop, it just changed shape because every time there was a new reason, a new explanation that somehow sounded logical enough for me not to question it too deeply, and every time he promised that it was the last time, that everything would stabilize soon, that once we were married we would laugh about this period and forget it ever happened. At the same time, the wedding kept moving further away, not cancelled, never directly, just delayed with reasons that sounded responsible on the surface, like wanting to be financially secure first, wanting to give me the kind of wedding I deserved, wanting everything to be perfect, and I kept telling myself that this was a sign of maturity, not avoidance. But there were small things, the kind of details you almost ignore because they don't make sense on their own, like how he would suddenly turn his phone screen away when I walked into the room, or how he started taking calls in another space and closing the door behind him, or how sometimes he would disappear for hours and come back with an explanation that sounded complete, but somehow still left me feeling like something had been carefully edited out. I noticed those things, of course I did, but I also noticed how easy it was to silence my own doubts, because every time I got close to asking a direct question, he would do something that pulled me back in, like talking about our honeymoon plans or showing me apartments he had saved for us, and I kept choosing the version of reality where everything was fine because the alternative felt too big, too destructive, too impossible to deal with. And the truth is, I didn't just trust him, I built my entire future around him, which meant that questioning him didn't just threaten the relationship, it threatened everything I thought my life was about to become. The moment everything actually broke didn't feel dramatic at first. It wasn't some huge confrontation or a perfectly timed discovery. It was quiet and almost shiny, which is probably why it hit so much harder, because there was no time to prepare myself or to soften what I was about to see. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to shower, and that alone wasn't unusual, because even though he had become more private lately, there were still moments where he acted like nothing had changed, like we were still that couple who had nothing to hide from each other, and I remember standing there, not even planning to touch it, just making coffee and trying to ignore the constant low-level anxiety that had become my normal. Then the screen lit up. I didn't even look at it right away because I had trained myself not to be the kind of partner who respects boundaries, who doesn't snoop, who doesn't go looking for problems, but something about the way my name wasn't on that notification, something about the instinctive feeling that this mattered, made me glance at it before I could stop myself. The message preview was short, but it was enough. Did you tell her about the money? Or, are you still lying to both of us? I think my brain tried to protect me in that moment, because instead of immediately understanding what that meant, I stood there staring at the screen like it was written in a language I didn't fully recognize, rereading the same sentence over and over again, as if the meaning might change if I gave it enough time. And then something inside me shifted, very quietly but very definitively, because I realized that there was no version of that message that made sense in the life I thought I was living. My hands were shaking when I picked up the phone, and I kept telling myself that I was about to find something small, something explainable, something that would make me feel stupid for even worrying, but at the same time there was this heavy, sinking feeling in my chest that already knew I wasn't going to get that kind of relief. The conversation was already open. And the worst part wasn't even the tone. It wasn't the anger or the accusation. It was how familiar everything sounded, because as I scrolled, I started recognizing phrases, sentences, even whole explanations that I had heard before, except they weren't written to me. He was telling her the same story. The same temporary financial problem, the same delayed payment, the same promise that everything would be fixed soon, that he just needed a little more time, a little more help, and reading it felt like watching someone replay my own memories with a different person in my place. I don't know how long I stood there, scrolling, because time didn't feel real anymore. It just stretched into this endless loop of message after message, each one making it harder to breathe, each one stripping away another layer of the person I thought I knew. And then I saw it. A number, an amount of money she had sent him, and it wasn't small. It was almost exactly the same amount I had given him just a week before. That's when the denial finally collapsed, not slowly, not gently, but all at once, because there was no misunderstanding left, no possible explanation that could fit around what I was seeing, no version of reality where this was still just stress or bad timing or anything even remotely innocent. I wasn't helping my fiancé through a difficult period. I was one of several people funding a lie. And the worst part wasn't even that he had betrayed me. It was the realization that everything I thought was ours had never really belonged to us at all, because he had been building the same future with someone else, using the same words, the same promises, the same carefully constructed illusion. I heard the shower turn off. And in that moment, I didn't panic, I didn't rush, I didn't even put the phone down right away, because something inside me had gone completely still, like all the emotion had been pushed aside to make room for something colder, something clearer. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to understand him. I was trying to understand how far this actually went. I don't know exactly what made me do it, whether it was anger or clarity or just the need to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But instead of putting the phone back and pretending I hadn't seen anything, I opened her profile and stared at her picture for a long moment, trying to understand who she was and how she fit into a life I thought I fully understood. She looked normal, not like some exaggerated version of a mistress you imagine when you're trying to protect yourself from the truth, but like a real person with her own life, her own friends, her own reality, and that somehow made it worse, because it meant this wasn't a chance or a one-time mistake. It was something structured, something intentional. My first instinct was to hate her. My second instinct was to realize she probably had no idea I even existed. And that second thought is the one that stayed. I took a screenshot of the conversation, then another, until I had enough to prove that this wasn't just flirting or confusion or something I could explain away, and my hands were still shaking, but not from panic anymore, more like from adrenaline, like my body had switched into a different mode entirely. For a few minutes, I just stared at her name, trying to decide if I should message her at all, because once I did that, there would be no going back to ignorance, no way to pretend that things were still uncertain or unclear. Then I typed, "Hi, I think we need to talk about him." I didn't over-explain, I didn't accuse, I didn't even use his name, because something told me that if she was in the same situation I was, she would understand immediately. She replied faster than I expected. "Who is this?" I hesitated for a second, then wrote the truth in the simplest way possible. "I'm his fiancé." There was a pause after that, long enough for me to feel the weight of what I had just said, long enough for me to imagine her reading it and reacting in the exact same way I had just reacted to her messages. When she finally answered, it wasn't denial. It wasn't anger. It was confusion. "That's not possible. We've been together for over a year." I remember reading that sentence and feeling something inside me almost break again, because there it was, another version of my own story, another timeline that existed alongside mine without me ever knowing about it. And suddenly it wasn't just betrayal, it was duplication, repetition, a pattern that was too consistent to ignore. We started comparing details, dates, trips, and stories he had told us. And with every message, the overlap became impossible to deny, because he hadn't even tried to be creative about it. He had reused the same explanations, the same emotional appeals, the same promises about the future, like we were interchangeable pieces in something he had perfected over time. At some point, she sent me a screenshot. A transfer, a large one. And when I saw the date, I realized it was sent just 2 days after I had given him money for what he called an urgent payment he couldn't delay. That's when the conversation shifted, because we both stopped asking if this was real and started asking how big it actually was. She was the one who found the third. It wasn't intentional at first. It came from something small, a tagged photo, a comment that didn't make sense until you looked at it from the right angle, and when she sent me that profile, I felt that same heavy silence settle in my chest again, the kind that tells you you're about to confirm something you already know. I reached out again. This time, I didn't hesitate. "Hi, I think we're both being lied to." The response didn't come immediately, but when it did, it changed everything. "I was wondering when one of you would find me." I read that line over and over again because it carried something different, not confusion, not shock, but awareness, like she had already been living in this reality while we were just stepping into it. We got on a call, all three of us. And I don't think I will ever forget the feeling of hearing their voices, of realizing that we were strangers connected by the exact same lies, the exact same promises, the exact same man who had somehow managed to keep all of us just close enough to believe in him, but far enough apart to never cross paths. We compared everything. And by the end of that conversation, there was no doubt left, no missing piece, no room for misunderstanding. We weren't exceptions. We were a system. And for the first time since I saw that message on his phone, I didn't feel confused. I felt focused. After that call, everything became painfully clear, not just what he had done, but how calculated it all was, because this wasn't chaos or coincidence. It was structure, repetition, a system he had clearly used more than once. And the moment we all understood that, the question stopped being why and became, what do we do next? None of us wanted to disappear quietly. None of us wanted closure in the form of a conversation where he would lie, apologize, and try to manipulate his way out of it. And most importantly, none of us wanted him to walk away and do this again to someone else. So we made a decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with a kind of cold clarity that only comes after the shock wears off and reality settles into something sharp and undeniable. We were going to make him face it, not separately, not in pieces, and all at once. We started by putting everything together, not just our stories but proof, because emotions don't hold up anywhere but facts do, and if this ended the way we were planning, we needed everything to be undeniable, documented, impossible to twist. We documented screenshots, dates, and messages. We lined them up side by side, and the pattern became almost disturbing in its precision because he had followed the same script with each of us, adjusting only small details like names, timing, and amounts, but never the core story, never the structure that kept us all believing just long enough. Then we built the setup. He thought he was still in control, still balancing timelines, still managing separate versions of reality, and that gave us the advantage because he had no idea those realities had already collided. I texted him first. I kept it normal, soft, familiar, exactly the way he expected me to sound, because the last thing we needed was for him to sense anything was off. I miss you, can we meet tomorrow? He replied almost instantly. Of course, I'll make time. That was the first confirmation that nothing had changed for him, that he still believed he was managing everything perfectly, that whatever he was doing had worked for him so far, and that confidence is exactly what we used. We chose a place he wouldn't question. A cafe we had been to before, somewhere neutral, somewhere public enough to keep things controlled, but quiet enough for everything to land without distraction. So we made a decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with a kind of cold clarity that only comes after the shock wears off and reality settles into something sharp and undeniable. We were going to make him face it. Not separately, not in pieces, and all at once. We started by putting everything together, not just our stories but proof, because emotions don't hold up anywhere but facts do, and if this ended the way we were planning, we needed everything to be undeniable, documented, impossible to twist. We documented screenshots, dates, and messages. We lined them up side by side, and the pattern became almost disturbing in its precision because he had followed the same script with each of us, adjusting only small details like names, timing, and amounts, but never the core story, never the structure that kept us all believing just long enough. Then we built the setup. He thought he was still in control, still balancing timelines, still managing separate versions of reality, and that gave us the advantage because he had no idea those realities had already collided. I texted him first. I kept it normal, soft, familiar, exactly the way he expected me to sound, because the last thing we needed was for him to sense anything was off. I miss you, can we meet tomorrow? He replied almost instantly. Of course, I'll make time. That was the first confirmation that nothing had changed for him, that he still believed he was managing everything perfectly, that whatever he was doing had worked for him so far, and that confidence is exactly what we used. We chose a place he wouldn't question. A cafe we had been to before, somewhere neutral, somewhere public enough to keep things controlled, but quiet enough for everything to land without distraction. Then something tighter, something closer to panic, even though he was still trying to hold it together. Hey, what are you doing here? He asked her, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Before she could answer, the door opened again. The third one walked in, and that's when everything broke. Because this time he didn't even try to pretend, he just stared, his eyes moving from one of us to the other, trying to connect something that clearly made no sense in his head, trying to find a version of reality where this was still manageable. There wasn't one. No one raised their voice, and no one made a scene. And that's exactly what made it worse for him. I leaned forward slightly and placed my phone on the table, the screen already open, messages visible, dates clear, transfers undeniable, and for the first time since I had known him, I didn't wait for him to speak. You don't have to explain, I said calmly, because this wasn't about giving him space to lie again. This was about removing every possible exit he thought he had. She placed her phone next to mine, then the third. 3 screens and 3 conversations. I watched his face as it all clicked, not gradually, not piece by piece, but all at once, because there is a very specific moment when someone realizes they've completely lost control, and you can see it, you can actually see the exact second it happens. He tried, of course. He started talking fast, jumping between explanations, trying to isolate us again, trying to turn it into misunderstandings, timing issues, anything that would break the connection we had already built. But it didn't work. Because for once, he wasn't speaking to 3 separate people. He was speaking to one reality. And he had no script for that. We didn't argue. We didn't insult him. We didn't even let him finish most of his sentences. Because everything that needed to be said was already on that table. All the lies and all the money. All the time he had taken from each of us. I stood up first. Not dramatically, not angrily, just done. We've already filed everything, I said, and that was the first time his expression changed into something real, something raw, because up until that point he still believed this was something he could talk his way out of. Fraud, she added. Scam, the third said quietly. And just like that, the last illusion disappeared. We walked out together. Not as victims. Not as people he had fooled. But as the one thing he never planned for. A consequence. I thought I was losing the man I was about to marry. But what I actually lost was a lie that would have cost me years of my life, my money, and my ability to trust myself. And the strangest part is, I don't even hate him anymore. Because the moment I saw the truth clearly, I stopped seeing him as someone powerful, and started seeing him as someone small. So tell me honestly, would you have exposed him like we did? Or would you have just walked away and never looked back? If stories like this hit you, subscribe.